Everyone. Okay, today we are finishing up with Descartes. We're going to look at meditations 4, 5, and 6. So we have just come out of the third meditation, which is focused on proving the existence of God. And in the fourth and fifth meditations, Descartes is sort of rehashing the main arguments from the first three meditations, offering additional proofs of God's existence and elaborating on the nature of judgment, the mind, and being a thinking thing. So he begins the fourth meditation by addressing the relation between himself and God. Again, the relation between a thinking thing and God. And he highlights again, or he begins the fourth meditation by immediately rehashing the last point of the third meditation. And this is an extremely important point for the rest of his meditations, which is that God is not a deceiver. So, the proof of God and the proof of God's existence is roughly that there is truth. Truth is perfect. Perfection can only be caused by a perfect being, and therefore there must be a perfect being that is the cause of perfect truth. So God exists, and he exists necessarily as perfection. God, therefore, cannot be a deceiver, because deceit would be an imperfection. Deceiving would only be done by a being that is less than perfect. Right? Deception is a kind of imperfection. Now, generally, the idea here is that a perfect being would never be the cause of anything imperfect. And this is roughly along the same lines as something can't come from nothing. Right? A perfect being could only produce that which belongs to it, right? Which it comes from its essence, and its essence is perfection. So it would only be able to produce other perfect things. So the idea that God could be a deceiver, the idea of an evil demon, this evil genius who's deceiving me in every way, is dismissed because God has been necessarily established to be perfect, and a perfect being would not deceive. All right, so this is our starting point for the fourth and fifth, and most importantly, probably the sixth meditation. God cannot be a deceiver. Right? There is perfection, and perfection can't be the cause of imperfection. The other important point that Descartes reiterates at the beginning of the fourth meditation is my relation to God, right? Descartes' relation to God, the thinking things relation to God, and the critical distinction between the thinking thing, Descartes, and God is that one is dependent on the other. The other way we could think about this proof of God is simply to say that I recognize that I, a thinking thing, am limited, fallible, I make mistakes, and I am dependent on things. When I hit upon a truth, when I um, experience truth, I have to recognize that that truth is not my own invention, that I am not responsible for the nature of truth itself. Truth depends on something greater than me. Uh, the fact of my dependence on something else, right? The fact that I know not only that I'm not the author of truth itself, that truth is not invented by me, but also that in a more general way, I'm dependent on a number of things, right? I know that I didn't create myself, that I'm dependent on my parents for having created me. I'm dependent on food and air and water in order to keep my body alive. Um, I'm dependent on, right, the natural light, truth, in order to know anything. So in many ways, I am dependent, right? He writes on page 53 in the Universal Pagination, when I consider the fact that I have doubts or that I am a thing that is incomplete and dependent, then there arises in me a clear and distinct idea of a being who is independent and complete, that is, an idea of God. So the very fact of being dependent, that I recognize myself as dependent on all these other things, leads me to the idea of something that is truly independent, that is genuinely independent. That is to say, right, what we mean by independent, we would mean self-caused and the author of truth. Right. So, what could that be other than God? Right. To say that something is entirely independent implies that it is self-caused. Anything that is caused by something other than itself will be dependent on something. So to be wholly and completely independent means to be self-caused. And anything that is self-caused will be God, right? So this idea of being self-caused, that God is self-caused, is an extremely important definition of God and an extremely important idea for modern philosophy after Descartes. Um, and in Spinoza, in Hume, in Kant, we'll see different sort of problems with this idea of being self-caused. Right? How can something be its own cause? For something to be self-caused, uh, that thing would have to come from nothing. Right? How could something bring itself into existence without the help of anything else? It would have to bring itself into existence from out of nothing, or else have always existed, have never come into existence, and never go out of existence. All right, so that's a big idea, and we'll talk about that in other sections. But for now, all we need to recognize is the necessity um, of some kind of independent and self-caused being. My dependence reveals that there must be something which is independent, something at the end of the line upon which all dependent beings depend. And that independent thing must be God. So, God is independent. God exists. God is not a deceiver. I exist. I am dependent on God, and I am often deceived. Right? So this raises the next big philosophical question, which is, how is it that I am deceived? Right? If God is not a deceiver, and if deceit can't come from God in general, then how is it that I'm deceived? Who deceives me? Why is there deception? Why is, more generally, there error? What is the cause of error? Why does God allow us to make errors? Uh, so, setting up a discussion about judgment, right? Correct use of judgment. Because now that I know that I exist and that God exists, that something external to me exists, all that remains is for me to understand how to use my judgment in such a way that I will know the truth and not be deceived about what is external to me. I'm a thinking thing. There is an external world. Now I have to figure out how to use the faculties that belong to me as a thinking thing, right? Judging, willing, affirming, denying, doubting, in order to accurately assess the external world, to know what in the external world is true and false. So I need to correctly use my judgment, figure out how to use my judgment correctly. So he writes again on page 53, going on to 54. To begin with, I recognize that it is impossible that God should ever deceive me. For in every case of trickery or deception, some imperfection or power, the will to deceive is undoubtedly evidence of malice or weakness, and so cannot apply to God. Right? The reason why God does not deceive is not that he could not deceive, but that he would not deceive. Right? It's a question of will for Descartes. Right? The will to deceive is evidence of malice and weakness, which are imperfections. So he goes on. Next, I know by experience that there is in me a faculty of judgment, which, like everything else which is in me, I certainly received from God. Okay. God has given me the power of judgment. So, judgment is God given. We might ask, okay, how do you know that judgment comes from God? Have you sufficiently shown that all of your faculties of what you call thought, intellect, are equally derived from God? For Descartes, the mind is a unified thing, and all of its faculties, the pure intellectual faculties, are united in the mind. And so the mind, because it is unified and dependent ultimately on this independent being of God, must be directly derived from God. And therefore, the faculties of mind must be God given. So my judgment is, as it were, guaranteed by God. He says, since God does not wish to deceive me, he surely did not give me the kind of faculty which would ever enable me to go wrong while using it correctly. So this is the key word, right? Correctly, or key phrase, using it correctly. My judgment is perfect, provided I use it correctly. right? So judgment is a tool that I've been given by God, and as such, it is perfect. But it is uh, wielded by me, right? It's not wielded by God. It is a perfect tool given to an imperfect being, right? And so now my task is to figure out how to use this perfect tool of judgment perfectly, right? What is the correct use of judgment? So that is our main question here. How do we use our judgment correctly? Uh, and this is an incredibly important question. Um, when I was rereading this this time around, I was thinking about judgment in relation to conspiracy theories, in relation to the widespread doubt about media, news media in the United States, and thinking about, to what extent Descartes' theory of judgment might be applicable to this sort of, as this same news media calls it, post-truth error, post-truth era. uh, um, Hopefully, we'll have a chance to circle back to this question at the end. But I'll say that uh, at the outset, I'm not sure that Descartes' theory of judgment has anything useful to say when it comes to things like QAnon, conspiracy theories, um, or maybe it does. Maybe it does. Let's see. Um, Certainly, not to get started on a tangent too soon, but certainly this question of how do we judge what's true about the world? How do I know what in the world is actually true? How do I use my judgment so as to guard against untruths that are presented to me, either by my senses or by my friends, by politicians, by news media? How can I train my judgment to navigate all of these deceptions and illusions and falsehoods? Uh, and as we'll see, I think Descartes' answer is very helpful up until the point when it becomes completely useless. So hopefully I'll remember to circle back and say a little bit more about that once we actually see his theory of judgment. Now, before we get into that question of judgment, we have to work through an older philosophical problem, that this problem of deception and the mistaken use of judgment or error in general presents. This is what Descartes deals with before getting into the problem of judgment. And this is this question that I mentioned before that little tangent, which is, how can there be error? How is it that I can be deceived? If God is not a deceiver, why am I deceived? If I am caused by God, why am I imperfect? Right? If God only makes perfect beings, if a perfect being can only cause another perfect being to come into existence, how can any of God's creations be imperfect in the sense of be deceived, be wrong, live in error? So let me revise that a little bit. It's not that God only makes perfect beings in the sense that all beings are equally perfect to God, but that what God makes will be perfectly made for what they are. So the human is a creation of God's that, were it to act as it should, as it's intended, would be perfect within its bounds, within its limits. The key difference between God and God's creations is that God is unlimited, eternal, all-knowing and all-powerful. That's the nature of God's perfection. Whereas God's creations are limited, dependent, finite, and therefore, dependent, therefore incomplete, we might say. Not as complete as God. So I have the potential to be perfect as a human being. I don't have the potential to be as perfect as God, obviously. So where does error come from? He writes again on page 54. On looking for the cause of these errors, I find that I possess not only a real and positive idea of God, or a being who is supremely perfect, but also what may be described as a negative idea of nothingness, or of that which is farthest removed from all perfection. I realize that I am, as it were, something intermediate between God and nothingness, or between supreme being and non-being. My nature is such that insofar as I was created by the supreme being, there is nothing in me to enable me to go wrong or lead me astray. But insofar as I participate in nothingness or non-being, that is, insofar as I am not myself the supreme being and am lacking in countless respects, it is no wonder that I make mistakes. Right? So I am a combination of supreme being and nothingness. Right? I am an intermediary, something intermediate between God and nothingness. Now, this is a fascinating idea. So, I participate in nothingness as a human being. What this means is simply that I am, as I was just saying, incomplete. I am limited. I'm finite. To participate in nothingness simply means to not be eternal, infinite, omniscient, omnipotent. Right? This is what he means by a negative idea of nothingness. That is to say, nothingness understood simply as a lack, an absence. I participate in nothingness to the extent that I lack attributes that God has, to the extent that I'm not identical to God. To the extent that I'm not identical to God, I am nothingness. I participate in nothingness. I participate in, as Descartes says, non-being. Now, this non-being that I participate in, this nothingness, is going to be primarily intellectual, insofar as where I go wrong, the part of me that errs, that makes errors, is the intellectual part. So, to the extent that I am not, uh, the extent to which I am not is the extent to which I believe things that aren't true. I am separated from God, separated from being, to the extent that uh, I judge things wrongly. Now, this is very interesting, right? Remember that Descartes says, I believe it's in the third meditation, it says, right, I'm, I know I exist only when I'm thinking. When I'm not thinking, I don't know I exist. Something similar is happening here. When I judge things correctly, when I use my judgment correctly and know the truth, then I am unified with being. I'm unified with God. I am more fully. When I use my judgment wrongly and believe something false, I am divorced from being, separated from being. I'm participating in non being. So that my unity with being and my unity with God depends on the proper use of my judgment, depends on my ability to discern between truth and untruth. My very being depends on my ability to recognize truth. Uh, there are all sorts of huge um, implications to this. And I don't want to get sucked down a rabbit hole too much. But um, I do want to flag, because it's an important metaphysical idea, that what Descartes is doing here is reaffirming one of the most ancient and traditional metaphysical concepts, which is the unity of thought and being. That being and thought uh, are consubstantial, are one and the same in some sense. That whatever is can be thought, and whatever can be thought is. Uh, at the risk of, I feel myself being drawn down an hour-long tangent, so I'm going to press pause on that. Um, but I want to hammer home, or I want to underline again, that uh, we could say honing your judgment allows you to, as we might say, live in truth. For those who are able to live in truth, there is a greater fullness of being. Uh, so that correct use of judgment is also about fullness of being, the ability to fully participate in what is, in being, rather than in non-being. This is an important point that's going to come back at the end of the sixth meditation also. What does it mean to more fully be in being. It means to understand the full connectedness of being, a connectedness that ultimately, for Descartes, will lead back to uh, God as the cause of all being. When we use our judgment correctly, we see the necessary bonds that make the world and being a unity. When we don't use our judgment correctly, when we believe false things, the world becomes fragmented, becomes incoherent. It stops being discernible as a unity. Uh, so, this is the real sort of danger of falsehood and of incorrect use of judgment, that through incorrect use of judgment, it's not simply that you believe things that aren't true, but that in believing things that aren't true, uh, the world begins to fall apart. Or what the consequence of believing untrue things is the deterioration of the world, the loss of the unity of the world. All right. Um, so when I participate in non-being through bad judgment, I am participating in my privation. Mm-mm. Uh, by that I mean, well, when I misuse my judgment, the world also can take on uh, larger sort of false guises. Uh, Now, what I'm trying to get at, or what Descartes is trying to get at, is the extent to which our judgments can transform the world. Uh, and how, moreover, we have to let me start again. So, as we think about how to use our judgment, we have to uh, be on the lookout for the possibility that even large ideas are wrong. um, what I'm trying to get at here, sorry. In the use of our judgment, we go wrong very often. And there are certain things about which we can never have knowledge. This is the key point. Uh, the fact that I am finite while God is infinite means that there are parts of being, there are parts of existence, there are certain questions about existence that I can never have an answer to, or it seems that I can never have an answer to. For example, Descartes says, I can never have knowledge about final causes in physics. Um, as I reflect on these matters more attentively, Descartes writes on page 55, it occurs to me, first of all, that it is no cause for surprise if I do not understand the reasons for some of God's actions. And there is no call to doubt his existence if I happen to find that there are other instances where I do not grasp why or how certain things were made by him. For since I now know that my own nature is very weak and limited, whereas the nature of God is immense, incomprehensible, and infinite, I also know, without more ado, that he is capable of countless things whose causes are beyond my knowledge. Right? So there's a lot in the world that I simply cannot understand. And this is a really important point in the meditation, right? That prior to Descartes, there is a certain sense that everything could be understood through the human mind, or everything that is can be understood. Descartes is saying, no, certainly not, right? Being uh, is godlike. Being is caused by God. And as such, there are going to be parts of being that are much larger than us, beyond our finite limits. So we have to accept that there are certain parts of being that we will simply never understand. Certain questions we'll never have answers to. So he says, and for this reason alone, I consider the customary search for final causes to be totally useless in physics. What he's saying here is that we can never know the purpose of being. This is incredibly important. This is also a rebuke to Aristotle's concept of physics, traditional metaphysics and traditional physics. Final purposes refer to the purposes. Final causes refer to the purposes of things. So, again, in danger of falling down a rabbit hole here. But for Aristotle, everything has 4 essential causes. There is the first cause, that which God who brings all things into existence. There is the material cause. There are 5 causes. Sometimes you leave out the first cause. So let's say 5 causes. The first cause is God. The 4 other causes are formal cause, material cause, the form and matter of a thing, its shape and material. Then there's the efficient cause, the thing that actually brings something into existence, and the final cause, the reason why something was brought into existence, the purpose of the thing. So if I am analyzing this book again, right, I'd say, well, the first cause is the first cause of all things, the reason why anything at all exists. It is God. It is, in Aristotle's language, the prime mover. Fine, right? But in a more specific analysis, we'd say, what are the causes of this book? Why does this book exist? Well, it's able to exist because it has a formal cause, right? It has a particular shape, right? Books are, generally rectangular. They're bound. There's a certain form to a book. It has pages. The pages have a certain thinness. It has a cover, etc. Right? There's a formal nature to books, and I know this is a book. One of the reasons why it's a book is because it has that form. Similarly, there will be a material cause, right? There is a certain kind of matter that is required for the book to exist, right? So the paper and cardboard of the cover will be the material causes of the book. It would be impossible for the book to exist if it weren't for the matter of which it's made. So the formal and material causes. But then we also have the efficient cause, the direct or immediate cause, not the first cause all the way back with God or the prime mover, but the cause that actually brought the book into existence. And we'd say the efficient causes of the book, most immediately would be the printer, right? The printer that actually prints the pages and then binds them together and makes it a book. That's the efficient cause of the book. We might also look to other efficient causes, right? The publisher, the editor, the author, etc. But then finally, we have the final cause of something, right? Which is the purpose. So the final cause of the book is the reason why it was brought into existence in the first place. And in this case, that would be to prove the existence of God. What's the purpose of the existence of this book? To prove the existence of God, to prove the existence of myself, and to find a new foundation for philosophy and the sciences. So, in an Aristotelian analysis of being, one would have to understand all of the causes of being. And so, in Aristotelian physics, we would want to have an understanding of the final cause of being. Why does the universe exist? For what reason was the universe brought into existence? What's the purpose of being? This, sort of cartoonish, stereotypical philosophical question, right? Why am I here? What's the purpose of existence? Not a terrible question. It's a good question. There have been good answers to it, throughout the history of philosophy, certainly after Descartes also. But right, Descartes is going to argue that while it might be true that there is a purpose to existence, we can never know what the purpose of existence is. Right? It is outside the limits of our power of judgment to know why we exist, what the purpose of existence is. So, first of all, we have to understand our limitation and the fact that we can't know everything through our judgment. We have to restrict our judgment, restrain ourselves from making judgments about things that we can't know. So, a little tangential here, but what is the, this doesn't explain why we err, why we make errors. He says on page 58 that the cause of our errors is not, strictly speaking, about the faculty of our judgment itself, but instead it is about the imbalance between our will and our judgment. On page 58, he writes, "So what then is the source of my mistakes? It must be simply this: the scope of the will is wider than that of the intellect. But instead of restricting it within the same limits, I extend its use to matters which I do not understand." All right, so for Descartes, I have an infinite will. On page 57, he writes, "It is only the will, or freedom of choice, which I experience within me to be so great that the idea of any greater faculty is beyond my grasp. So much so that it is above all in virtue of the will that I understand myself to bear in some way the image and likeness of God. All right, so I am a thinking thing. This thinking thing has certain faculties, certain acts of thought which it's capable of. The most powerful faculty that the thinking thing has is the faculty of will, of freedom of choice. And in this faculty, we are infinite. It is by virtue of our will that we are most like God. Remember, at the end of the first meditation, when Descartes doubts everything, he isn't sure even that he himself exists. Right before he hits on the cogito, he's still able to withhold his assent. He's still able to doubt, to stand by his doubt. That's an act of will. And you'll remember we said this is an extraordinary moment where Descartes is able, as this finite, confused, deceived, limited being, he's able to stand up against this all-powerful evil deceiver simply by withholding assent. Now that's such an important phrase, right? Withholding assent. For Descartes, that is an act of will, right? The will to withhold assent, the will to not judge, to not make a judgment, right? And that act of will is so powerful as to be able to contend with a godlike power. So the human will is extremely powerful and infinite. We always have the ability to choose. We always have freedom. We can always, at the very least, withhold our assent from something. We can always withhold judgment. We can always say, I don't know. So, this will is the sense in which we are made in God's image, according to Descartes. The fact that the will is infinite, while judgment is so limited, does not, for Descartes, mean that the thinking thing is not unified. These faculties belong to it as a unity, nevertheless. So, I have this infinite will, infinite freedom, but I have this very limited intellect, very limited power of judgment, ability to know what's true and not. So, wherever I have the will to know, but not the power to know, power of judgment to truly and reliably discern the truth, that's where I'm going to make mistakes. So the example of final causes in physics is a good one. I really want to know why I'm here, what the purpose of being is. Right? However, if I make a judgment about that, about why I'm here, that judgment is not going to be based on truth. Descartes thinks I can't have judgment about why the universe exists. So wherever my will exceeds my power of judgment, I will be deceived. So if there are any ethics to Descartes' metaphysics here, any attendant ethics, it would seem that this is it. Right? I have a duty to restrain uh, my judgment, to prevent myself from making judgments about things I can't know simply because I want to know. I can decide, I can will and choose that the purpose of existence is to study philosophy. And anyone who doesn't study philosophy is failing to live up to the purpose of life, the purpose of existence. The purpose of existence is to smoke cigarettes and drink whiskey, right? Anyone who doesn't do those things is failing to live up to their potential and essence. They're not being what they should be. uh, Either one of those could be true. It could equally be true. Um, and if I say one of these is true, and if I judge that one of those ideas is true, um, right, I have no evidence. There's nothing compelling me to believe one or the other. And so that is a case of misusing my judgment, right? Letting my will run away with itself. Now, I want to say one. I want to look at the nature of this judgment, and then we'll pause before we move on to the fifth meditation. Judgment is free, just as the will is free. However, free judgment is compelled by truth. Remember, judgment comes from God, and therefore, the tool of judgment is designed to seek out truth, to seek out the difference between truth and falsity. Judgment is a tool that has the power to discern between truth and falsity. How? What does that power consist in? It consists in this inclination toward truth. It is that part of us that is compelled by truth. That when you experience the truth, you can't help but acknowledge it as truth. That ability is the power of judgment. Right? The experience of truth. I hesitate to call it a feeling, but it is but I will. It's the feeling of truth. Right? So I want to read page 58 on to 59. He writes, for example, during these past few days, I've been asking whether anything in the world exists. And I've realized that from the very fact of my raising this question, it follows quite evidently that I exist. I could not but judge that something which I understood so clearly was true. I could not but judge that something which I understood so clearly was true. I was compelled to judge that this was true. But this was not because I was compelled so to judge by an external force, but because a great light in the intellect was followed by a great inclination in the will. And thus the spontaneity and freedom of my belief was all the greater in proportion to my lack of indifference. So, the will is compelled toward a light in the intellect. a truth. And this is a free, spontaneous act, right? Uh, what is that great light, right? This is the natural light. It is the intellectual uh, clarity of truth, right? The logical, intellectual experience of truth. Now, what is it that makes me recognize that clarity as more real, as truth, rather than illusion? That is to say, in my mind, right, I can think 2 plus 2 equals 4 and 2 plus 2 equals 5. And one of these will be clear, the other will be unclear. One will be true, one will be false. But what is it that makes me know the difference? There's clarity in 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? In that it's true, but in that it's demonstrable. I'm able to understand 2 plus 2 equals 4. I'm not able to understand 2 plus 2 equals 5. But we've just said, right, the fact that I'm not able to understand it doesn't mean it's not true. So why does understanding lead to belief about reality? That not only do I understand 2 plus 2 equals 4, but that is real and true. The answer will be that this great light, understanding, is followed by a great inclination in the will. Right? So the understanding compels the will to belief. And that compulsion, the fact that the will is compelled by understanding, that judgment is compelled by understanding, that is the tool of judgment operating correctly. That compulsion, again, is not, as Descartes says, something external, but internal. That compulsion is not something that I'm forced to do by something else. It's not that that my belief in my understanding is forced upon me. Or that I necessarily have to believe it. But that this compulsion is my freedom. What makes me free? The fact that I'm able to recognize truth. The fact that when I have understanding, I choose to believe that understanding. That's my freedom. Right? So my judgment when operating correctly is this compulsion. This compulsion is the unity of mind and will. It is my ability to live fully in being, to grasp the truth as indubitable. Whenever I assent to something without being compelled by this great light, I am misusing my judgment and also acting without freedom. So a little bit above this, page 57 going to 58, he writes, "In order to be free, there is no need for me to be capable of moving both ways." That is to say, freedom doesn't mean the ability to decide if you believe 2 plus 2 is 4 or 2 plus 2 is 5. On the contrary, the more I incline in one direction, either because I clearly understand the reasons of truth and goodness that point that way, or because of a divinely produced disposition of my inmost thoughts, the freer is my choice. So the more I incline in one direction, the freer is my choice. Freedom is the freedom to know the difference between truth and illusion. Freedom means knowing the truth, even though I don't get to decide what the truth is. Freedom doesn't mean deciding what is true. Freedom doesn't mean indifference to whether or not 2 plus 2 is 4 or 5. Freedom means having the power of judgment to know that your understanding of 2 plus 2 equals 4 makes that truer and realer than 2 plus 2 equals 5. So freedom is the power to know the truth, even though you can't choose what that truth is. Freedom is not the ability to decide what is true. It's a strange concept of freedom, right? But this is an idea of freedom that will come back again in later philosophy. So, wherever I don't have a clear and distinct understanding, wherever my judgment is not compelled by the force of that understanding, I am in danger of misusing my judgment. Wherever I don't feel that compulsion toward that great light in the intellect, the understanding, I must withhold judgment. I must refrain from making a judgment. This is the great prescription of Descartes. What is the foundation of the sciences? What is the foundation of philosophy? Whatever it will be built by refraining from judging where we don't have clear and distinct understanding. So, I want to just circle back for a second to this question about truth in the world, conspiracy theories, fake news, etc. For Descartes, one should neither believe what one is told whether it's conspiracy or news. Right? One should only believe what one has a very clear understanding of. So I said that it's very helpful up until the point where it's not. the theory is very helpful in that uh, if we all used our judgment, as Descartes is advising, then no one would believe any falsehoods. Right? So in general, it's a good practice in that sense. Um, Only believe what you have a very clear and distinct understanding of. Mm. But the problem, the point where it becomes useless, is that we have a clear and distinct understanding of so very little. Uh, if I were to say that this were a way to use your judgment to discern between truth and illusion or falsity in the context of understanding what's really happening in the world, in the context of QAnon and 9/11 truth and conspiracies like that, or for that matter, in knowing the truth about what's happening in Afghanistan, what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in China, right? You've got no idea. The news media tells you things. You have no clear and distinct understanding of any of that. Right? Using Descartes' metric, right, we would have to doubt everything that we hear on the news. Basically, doubt everything that comes to us through anyone but ourselves. Anything that comes to us by any means except through um, our own understanding. Um, so, yes, using Descartes' method would prevent you from ever believing anything that's false, but it would prevent you from believing a great deal of things. Um, so let's pause for a second, and we'll pick up with the fifth meditation in a minute.